He thought it was just a faint whimper drifting through the jagged canyon, a small plea carried by the breeze that whispered of hidden perils. But Chuck Norris, who had arrived in southwestern Colorado expecting a peaceful visit with an old friend, sensed something more urgent behind that sorrowful cry. He stood at the edge of a treacherous ravine, eyes scanning the steep drop below, noticing how the boulders jutted out at ominous angles, yet locals had whispered about a dog that tumbled into the rocky depths, prompting a frantic search and rescue effort, and Chuck suspected the situation wasn't so simple. He spotted a rescue team gathered nearby, nervous expressions betraying the difficulty of the task ahead, a tense silence falling as they recognized him, some of them relieved that his reputation for fearless action preceded him, others uncertain about the next step. The bark echoed again, muffled by the wind rolling across the desert-like terrain, so Chuck crouched down, peering between twisted juniper branches toward the bottom of the ravine, searching for any flicker of movement. He caught sight of a trembling canine-shaped wedge between two slabs of rock formatted with dust, the dog seeming too frightened to move, perilously close to a sharp drop that could spell disaster if it stumbled. But another detail made Chuck's spine tingle: scattered footprints, some belonging to humans, others possibly from heavier animals, layered in the dirt at the ravine's edge, which hinted that something unusual had happened here, possibly forcing the dog to flee. Therefore Chuck approached the head of the rescue operation, a park ranger named Sullivan, who explained that the dog had been spotted the previous morning by hikers, the ravine itself notorious for sudden rockfalls and crumbling ledges, making any descent risky. The typical course of action involved specialized climbing gear and extreme caution, so Chuck examined the rescue ropes laid out on the ground, tested the carabiners with a firm tug, and asked who was planning to rappel down. Sullivan admitted that one of the rangers had volunteered but was anxious about the precarious rock faces, which prompted Chuck to nod calmly, asking if they had a harness that would fit him. The ranger hesitated, well aware of Chuck's reputation for taking bold risks, but eventually complied, the dog's whimper growing more desperate and fraying the rescue team's nerves, so Chuck wasted no time. He strapped himself into the harness, double-checked the knots, then secured the rope to a sturdy anchor point, everyone bracing themselves as he moved closer to the ravine's lip, carefully planting his boots on reliable footholds. The descent began slowly, but Chuck's concentration never wavered, each step lowering him deeper into the ravine, where shadows lengthened across jagged stones and the temperature seemed to drop by several degrees. Adrenaline pulsed through his veins as he guided himself down, scanning the rock walls for signs of instability, the dog below looking up in panic, ears flattened against its head. Chuck spoke gently, his voice echoing off the canyon walls, the dog tilting its head but remaining rooted to the spot. When Chuck drew nearer, he noticed small but alarming details, signs of recent human activity scattered across an outcropping of rock, footprints that seemed too fresh, scraps of half-buried trash, and a discarded glove near a hidden trail etched into the canyon's side. It hinted that someone had been using this otherwise deserted area for questionable purposes, and as Chuck focused on the ground, he noticed a suspiciously placed steel clamp half buried beneath gravel. It looked like the remnants of a trap hastily stashed away, so he realized the dog might not have just slipped, it could have been running away from something brutal. He reached the ledge where the dog was stranded, braced himself against the rock, and spoke calmly, the dog baring its teeth in fear, body trembling, but Chuck moved slowly, offering the back of his hand for the animal to sniff. Time felt like it stretched, every breath measured and cautious, the dog cautiously sniffing his hand, then letting out a soft whine. Chuck glanced around, spotting fresh claw marks on the stone, as though the dog had scrambled desperately to escape. Above him, the rescue team murmured words of encouragement, peering down with anxious eyes, Chuck signaling for them to hold position, then inching closer to the dog, readying a small slip collar he had brought. He carefully slid it over the animal's head, murmuring reassurances, once secured, whispering that everything would be all right. But the dog suddenly jerked, eyes wide, letting out a startled yelp as a rock tumbled nearby, causing Chuck to instinctively shield the dog with his body, preventing it from slipping off the ledge. He realized the area was more unstable than he had initially thought, therefore Chuck radioed up to Sullivan, explaining that he would need help stabilizing the ledge before attempting to hoist the dog upward. The rescue team lowered extra gear, but Chuck's thoughts kept drifting to the suspicious traps and footprints, and he glimpsed the faint outline of a pathway cutting through the canyon floor, the sort of trail that might be used by furtive figures seeking secrecy, not common hikers. The dog, with a new sense of trust, allowed Chuck to gently pick it up, so he fitted a protective harness around its torso, then attached a second rope, carefully guiding the frightened animal closer to the primary rope, looking up, signaling the team to start hoisting. The ascent was nerve-wracking, every small shift in the rocks threatening to send debris tumbling below. Chuck remained calm, guiding the dog's movements so it wouldn't flail and slip free. At last they neared the top, the dog whimpering each time the rope jerked, until finally a pair of strong arms reached over the edge, pulling the dog onto safe ground. The team erupted in soft cheers, relieved that the canine was secure, and Chuck exhaled, still hanging just a few feet below the rim, scanning the ravine once more. He could have climbed out immediately, but a sudden curiosity spurred him to descend again, determined to see if the path below might reveal something urgent. Therefore he radioed Sullivan, explaining that he needed an additional few minutes to investigate the canyon floor, Sullivan sounding hesitant, warning Chuck that it was risky to venture deeper alone, but Chuck insisted it might be the only way to confirm the area was safe for others, including hikers or even children who sometimes explored these parts. He resumed his controlled descent, adjusting the rope to swing himself toward a narrow ledge that led to the base of the ravine, dust kicking up with each cautious step, filling the air with a gritty taste, jagged rocks framing the path, forcing him to crouch and sidestep. Eventually, he reached a small, rocky plateau, noticing a broken wooden crate wedged between large boulders. It bore faint stenciled letters he couldn't fully decipher, but the crate's design looked suspiciously like something used to transport illegal goods. A short distance away, he found more steel traps scattered among the rocks, some still set, their jaws poised to snare unwary animals, Chuck's eyes narrowing in anger. Poachers sometimes used cruel methods to catch wildlife, but it wasn't just that. He also spotted what looked like freshly disturbed earth near the wall of the ravine, as though someone had been digging. A battered shovel lay abandoned, its handle cracked, the smell of wet soil lingering, out of place in the arid environment. Carefully, Chuck inspected the partial hole, finding scattered fragments of bone, possibly belonging to hunted animals, and a battered can of chemical solvent lying nearby, a scene that suggested more than casual poaching. The presence of industrial solvent made Chuck wonder if someone had been searching for valuable minerals or illegally disposing of harmful chemicals in this remote canyon. He pulled out a small camera from his gear pouch, snapping a few pictures, determined to pass them on to the authorities. Then he decided he needed to see if there was further evidence, so he ventured along the rocky path, every step methodical, walls of the canyon looming overhead, blocking sunlight and casting an eerie gloom. Smaller side passages branched off, cluttered with debris and thick brush, Chuck considering the possibility that someone was using these hidden corridors to smuggle contraband or run an illegal operation. Up ahead, he noticed a faint metallic glint, approaching carefully, discovering a trail of nails and twisted wire, a crude sign lying face down, reading, "Danger, unstable ground." That looked official but battered, possibly tossed aside so others wouldn't heed the warning. Chuck placed a hand on the canyon wall, feeling a subtle vibration, realizing the rock wasn't stable, which explained the frequent collapses and falling debris. If someone was illegally digging or setting explosive charges, they could cause a devastating landslide, so Chuck radioed Sullivan again, describing what he had found, Sullivan's voice crackling with alarm, urging Chuck to return. But Chuck replied that he wanted to mark the location of the traps, so no one else would be endangered. The path took another sharp turn around a protruding stone, Chuck stooping low, brushing aside thorny shrubs, revealing a hidden cache of supplies, tarps, ropes, and a box of canned food. It confirmed that someone was camping out in the ravine, likely to avoid detection while continuing illicit activities. Therefore Chuck snapped more photos, then placed a small reflective marker near the campsite, hoping search teams could find it later. He paused, noticing the distant sound of shifting rock, a soft rumble that seemed to resonate through the canyon, Above, the rescue team had finished transporting the dog to safety, so Chuck knew it was only a matter of time before they secured the area. But if a group of criminals was operating here, the team could be in danger, which spurred Chuck to decide it was time to climb back. The angle of the sun told him he'd spent more time exploring than planned, and the risk of a rock slide increased as the temperature dropped. He found a secure anchor in the canyon floor, clipped himself in, and began ascending, muscles flexing with each pull, sweat trickling despite the cooler air below. The rope creaked under tension, Chuck's grip steady, until partway up, a chunk of rock gave way near his left hand, forcing him to cling to a more secure outcrop, dust billowing and momentarily blinding him, but he pressed on. Eventually, he cleared the rim, greeted by relieved expressions from the rescue team. Sullivan immediately approached, demanding to know what Chuck had discovered, so Chuck described the caches, traps, and signs of recent digging. Sullivan's eyes darkened, the gravity of the situation sinking in, the ranger admitting they had suspected some illegal activity, but no concrete proof until now. Chuck offered the camera's memory card, explaining that the dog likely scrambled away from either a trap or one of the hidden poachers, Sullivan agreeing to coordinate with law enforcement to investigate thoroughly, but Chuck insisted on joining, emphasizing that whoever was behind these activities might be armed. Meanwhile, the rescue dog rested in the back of a nearby truck, visited by a volunteer veterinarian who came to the scene, the dog's injuries minor, mostly bruises and scrapes, slowly beginning to calm down, wagging its tail when Chuck approached. He gave the animal a gentle pat, feeling a wave of relief, though that sense of relief was fleeting as night approached, draping the canyon in a thick, cool blanket of darkness, Sullivan and his small team preparing to sweep the upper perimeter, but Chuck advised caution. He warned them that if criminals were indeed operating in the ravine, they could have lookouts, so they arranged to move quietly, splitting into pairs. Chuck partnered with a deputy named Harper, a steady shot with a calm demeanor, navigating the rocky terrain with flashlights hooded, scanning for signs of suspicious movement. The night was eerily silent, broken only by the distant chirp of crickets, hours passing, tension thickening, until Chuck noticed a faint glow in the distance, off the main road. It looked like a lantern or small campfire, so he signaled Harper to proceed slowly, each footstep measured to avoid loose stones. As they crept closer, the outlines of two figures emerged, hunched over an open crate, one wearing a headlamp that illuminated jars of chemicals, the other fiddling with a metal detector, occasionally kneeling to dig. Chuck motioned for Harper to radio the others, the presence of these individuals with chemicals in hand confirming the suspicion of an illicit operation. The men seemed unaware of Chuck and Harper, too focused on rummaging through the crate, but Chuck also noticed rifles leaning against a nearby rock, meaning potential violence if the criminals felt threatened. Sullivan and another ranger soon arrived, flanking the opposite side of the campsite. Chuck signaled they should stay low, needing to confirm that these men were indeed setting traps and digging illegally. A shift in the wind carried the men's voices closer, letting Chuck and the others hear them complaining about the rocky soil and cursing that it was harder than expected to find valuable ore, one mentioning the need to set more traps to keep curious hikers away. Chuck's blood simmered, realizing these men had no qualms about harming animals or people. Therefore Chuck and the rangers sprang into action, stepping forward with weapons drawn, announcing themselves as law enforcement, the men whirling around in surprise, one lunging for his rifle. Harper barked a warning to drop it, but the man ignored him, raising the muzzle in defiance, so Chuck refused to hesitate. He darted forward, delivering a swift kick to disarm the man before he could fire, the second suspect raising his hands, wide-eyed, stumbling over the crate of chemicals. Sullivan dashed in to secure the rifle, while the other ranger cuffed the second suspect, Chuck pinning the first man's arms, wrestling him into submission, the tension finally breaking, replaced by heavy breathing and the crackle of the campfire. A quick search revealed more traps, illegal mining tools, and evidence linking these men to the hidden caches in the canyon, including a battered old notebook with scribbled notes about shipments of something called precious concentrate, possibly from deeper in the ravine, which explained the large-scale operation. Harper radioed for backup, ensuring more deputies arrived to process the scene, Chuck towering over the subdued suspects, frustration evident in his voice as he demanded to know why they unleashed such cruelty on wildlife. The men sneered, offering no remorse, claiming they had a right to profit off any land they could exploit, prompting Chuck's jaw to clench, he and Sullivan sharing a look of mutual disgust. By the time backup arrived, the suspects were loaded into a police vehicle, bound for the nearest holding facility. Sullivan thanked Chuck, acknowledging that without his timely investigation, they might never have discovered the operation in time. Chuck nodded, reminding the ranger that the real heroes were the entire team who put themselves at risk to protect the area. A few hours later, dawn broke over the canyon, painting the sky with streaks of pale pink and yellow, the rescue site quieter now, only a couple of park rangers remaining to secure the trail and remove leftover traps. Chuck wandered back toward the ravine's edge, gazing down at the spot where he'd found the terrified dog, wondering how many other animals might have fallen victim to these criminals, yet the knowledge that justice would be served offered a measure of solace. Therefore Chuck turned away, seeking out the dog that had triggered the entire chain of events, finding the volunteer veterinarian examining the animal near a cluster of vehicles, ensuring it had no hidden injuries. The dog wagged its tail upon seeing Chuck, ears perking up slightly, Chuck kneeling, giving the animal a soft rub behind the ears, smiling when it licked his hand, the veterinarian explaining that once they returned to town, the dog would be brought to a local shelter for more care and hopefully an adoption. Chuck felt a warm twinge of satisfaction, grateful that the animal's misfortune had led to something more impactful, exposing a network of poachers and illegal diggers who endangered the region. The following day, Chuck visited the sheriff's office, handing over the photos and detailed notes he had taken, speaking briefly with the county's Wildlife Enforcement Division, urging them to launch a more thorough search of the ravine for leftover traps or hidden explosives. The sheriff assured him they would coordinate with federal agencies if needed, especially because the suspects used specialized chemicals that might violate environmental laws. Chuck quietly left the office, mind churning with the gravity of what he had witnessed, originally planning to spend a few low-key days with an old friend, but fate had another agenda. He never seemed to shy from trouble, though it still surprised him how quickly he found himself tangling with criminals again. After that, Chuck drove through the small town, passing quaint storefronts and diners where residents gathered to exchange local news. Word of the rescue and the subsequent bust already circulated, a few people recognizing him, whispering appreciation. Chuck responded with polite nods, hoping they understood that everyone's vigilance played a part in protecting the land they called home. He headed back to the park ranger station one last time, Sullivan and Harper there, sorting out the mountain of paperwork that followed any law enforcement raid. They paused when Chuck walked in, smiling as Sullivan informed him the dog was improving quickly, local authorities locating more hidden traps deeper in the canyon, dismantling them before they harmed anyone else. Chuck let out a breath of relief, knowing future hikers or animals would no longer risk stumbling upon a cruel steel jaw. Sullivan expressed gratitude, explaining that Chuck's willingness to rappel down for the dog triggered a chain reaction that saved the region from worse harm. Chuck replied that the dog's safety was paramount, glad they ended a threat that could have persisted for months or years otherwise. By late afternoon, Chuck said his goodbyes, thanking them for their dedication, driving away from the station, his thoughts drifting to the dog and the unexpected alliances formed during that rescue. The canyons and ravines surrounding the town might look peaceful from a distance, but they harbored secrets that demanded vigilance. Eventually, Chuck parked his truck at a scenic overlook, stepping out to admire the sprawling desert landscape, red rock formations glowing in the evening light, steep cliffs carved by centuries of wind and water. It was breathtaking, yet he reflected on how easily such beauty could be tarnished by greed, realizing the criminals had nearly turned that quiet ravine into a danger zone for profit, caring nothing for the creatures or the land they harmed. But they failed, undone by a single terrified dog whose frantic whimper reached the right ears. Chuck closed his eyes, breathing in the crisp mountain air, feeling satisfaction in having intervened, in ensuring that an innocent life was spared and the region safeguarded. He also recognized that he was just one piece of a larger puzzle, park rangers, deputies, and volunteers all playing their part. More than once, Chuck recalled how the dog had looked at him with those frightened eyes, trust and fear warring in its gaze, underscoring the profound weight of responsibility humans held toward animals that couldn't defend themselves. The memory reminded him why he never hesitated to act against wrongdoing. Therefore, as the sun sank behind the rugged skyline, Chuck accepted that his work here was done, climbing back into his truck and setting off toward the open road, leaving the ravine behind but carrying the memory of a heroic rescue and the dismantling of a sinister threat. He hoped the future held a safer path for that brave dog, free from the terrors of hidden traps and illicit diggers, the desert winds whipping across his windshield, beckoning him onward. There was always another crisis on the horizon, another place requiring a vigilant eye and steady hand, so he drove with purpose, knowing that if he ever heard another lonely bark echoing from the shadows, he would answer without hesitation, that unspoken promise he made to himself every time he intervened for the vulnerable. Watch the next Chuck Norris stories on our channel, because his adventures never end and neither does the determination he brings to protect every living being in peril.